George Orwell told us in his novel 1984, quote, "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past," end quote. Why do we allow feminists to control the past? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. There is perhaps no subject of study in all of academia today whose takeover by feminist dogma has had more unfortunate consequences than that of history. Feminism has a lot of traction today, largely because we as a society have come to accept that our history has been one of men dominating women. It's the one thing I can rely on all my students to think they know, that up until about 20 years ago, men had all the rights, women none. In an earlier video, I talked about the widespread idea that when women won the right to vote in the early 20th century, that all men had been voting for many, many years, which isn't true, but the vast majority of people believe it is. And as a result of that perception, even when some aspect of our current social situation is clearly unjust, as in the cases of preferential hiring, rape shield law, or domestic violence policies, just to name a few, the injustice is considered acceptable, or at least not terrible, because of the idea that it is a corrective to make up for centuries during which women were mistreated and men had it way too good. Again, it isn't true. The vast majority of men never had privilege. But academic historians, the people who should be helping us toward a right understanding, are all too often in thrall to the feminist narrative. How this came to be is a fascinating story of cultural takeover. The academic discipline of history was traditionally the study of the great events that shaped societies at the macro level. It was the history of battles lost and won, of the development of forms of government and legal norms, and of large-scale economic changes. Then, out of the social ferment of the 1960s came an interest in a different kind of history, one that focused not on the epoch-making lives of great men, but on the everyday lives of ordinary people. Not coincidentally, this history also included a lot more women and was guided by an explicitly ideological commitment with cultural Marxist and feminist roots. It was called social history, and it turned its attention to the so-called marginalized and the oppressed, telling their stories as an act of protest against a society that had supposedly sidelined them. So much of what we now think we know about women and men in the past has filtered down to us from this kind of social history, the history always of women struggling heroically against oppressive conditions that supposedly benefited all men. It's a simplified, distorted view of the past that severely compromises our ability to come to fair conclusions about how we got to where we are today. And we desperately need an academic revolution that will provide us with a more accurate perspective. Now, this subject is too large to be addressed in one video, and unfortunately, I'm not a trained historian with the expertise to do so. But today, I want to look at one example of how general perceptions of history shaped by feminism have very little to do with reality. Most of us have been led to believe that before feminists tackled the issue of rape, we lived in a rape culture. Well, even more of a rape culture than they say we now live in. In other words, in the past, according to feminism, rape was considered normal, men weren't punished for it, and when it was recognized, women were blamed for supposedly asking for it. There were no protections for women. But a book by a scholar named Karen Dubinsky with the title Improper Advances, Rape, and Heterosexual Conflict in Ontario, 1880 to 1929, it shows that this couldn't be further from the truth. Dubinsky's examination of court records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries reveals that the protection of women from male sexuality and the punishment of male offenders were primary considerations in our supposedly patriarchal, brutal, misogynistic past. Now, the interesting thing is that Dubinsky herself is a feminist historian, and her feminism shows through strongly in her language and emphasis in the book. For example, she places a lot of stress on women's supposed lack of control over their sexual lives, which she sees as an aspect of the patriarchal oppression of women. So at the beginning of the 3rd chapter of her book, for example, she states, quote, "In a culture that denied full political and economic citizenship to women, it is not surprising that women were denied cultural and legal control over their sexuality. Then as now, women and men did not face each other as equals in the bedroom any more than they did in the factory, the street, or government institutions." End quote. Obviously, the implication of those sentences is that women suffered political, economic, and legal disabilities that men did not, and that most men, white men anyway, did have full political and economic citizenship and did have, quote, "cultural and legal control over their sexuality," end quote. In short, men had more power than women. But the many examples that Dubinsky provides simply do not support her feminist contention. What the examples show is that then, as now, women were protected under the law and men harshly punished even for consensual sexual relations. Dubinsky describes how in the early 1880s, a politician named John Charlton introduced a bill that became law in 1886 for what was then called the crime of seduction, which has fascinating parallels to our own era in its total rejection of the notion of consent. According to this definition of the crime, a man could be prosecuted for consensual sex under 3 different scenarios. First, if he had sex with a girl under the age of 16. Second, if he had sexual relations with a woman under the age of 21, if he had promised marriage to her, which he then reneged on. Or third, if she was his employee. Now, in condition number 2, women could claim that their consent was contingent on the man's promise of marriage and that she had been taken advantage of without her consent if the man changed his mind about marrying her, or if he had never really intended to. The maximum penalty for the crime of seduction was 2 years in prison. Dubinsky argues that the records of criminal prosecutions for seduction show how the state, quote, "entrenched the legal and parental regulation of women and punished women who transgress cultural prohibitions of female desire," end quote. That's feminist speak, obviously, for it harmed the women. But the examples show that although, yes, to some extent, female sexuality was being regulated, by far the greater social burden was being borne by men, who were often harshly punished for engaging in consensual sex. In one example, a 15-year-old girl named Mary Ellen T. became involved with one Patrick C., an Oshawa iron worker and boarder at Mary Ellen's family home. Interestingly, we're not told how old he was. Her father figured out that something was going on between them, and one night he spied on them having sex in the kitchen, as he later told the court. It was clearly consensual sex, not coerced, and it was sex that had been going on for some time. The next morning, the father went immediately to the police, who arrested Patrick. Mary did not even testify at the trial that found Patrick guilty of seduction. Dubinsky ends the account by saying that, quote, "It appears that in this case, prosecution acted to punish Patrick C. as well as his wayward girlfriend by ending what appears to have been a mutual desired relationship and by exposing her intimate life to public scrutiny, end quote. Well, that's one way of putting it, but I would be inclined to say that it was clearly Patrick who suffered the far more severe exposure of his intimate life to public scrutiny and on whom the real penalty fell. After all, Mary went back to her life in her father's house while Patrick went to jail. So uninterested is Dubinsky in the male side of things that she doesn't even tell us the length of the prison term to which Patrick was sentenced. In other examples, a woman or her parents could take a man to court in order to force him to marry her after she became pregnant. All she had to do in these cases in order to pursue a charge of criminal seduction was to allege that the man had at some point promised to marry her. Although such cases didn't always result in a successful prosecution, the threat itself, obviously, was often powerful enough to make the man agree to marriage. So this is clearly a case where, far from having control over their sexuality, men were at the mercy of women's claims and were often mandated by their society to fulfill the wishes of a woman and her family. Indeed, as Dubinsky alleged, men and women did not face each other as sexual equals, because only a man could commit a sexual crime and only a man could be forced to pay the penalty in jail time. So who had the least power here? Far from being victims of punitive social attitudes and predatory men, women had considerable social and legal clout in Victorian Canada, and there were significant measures then as now to protect women. It's too bad that this isn't more widely known. As I said earlier, we desperately need a revolution in scholarship that will give us a more accurate picture of women's and men's lives in the past, one that isn't governed by the model of the victimized woman and the privileged man. If you work or study social history, please be part of dismantling the feminist narrative. We owe it to ourselves and to future generations not to lie about the past.